Which country has a better power grid system, China or India? I often see people comparing China and India in some areas. But it's the first time I've seen anyone trying to compare power grids in China and India, and I'm a little surprised. In fact, the power grid is definitely one of the areas where the gap between China and India is greatest. 1. Power generation. But the gap with China is not 20%, nor 50%, nor even 100%. India's power generation capacity is only 20% of China's, or in other words, China's power generation capacity is 500% of India's. In fact, it is unfair to compare India's power generation scale with China's. China's power generation capacity is almost equal to the remaining 9 countries combined. 2. Grid structure. Although China's power grid is large in scale, its structure is relatively simple. There are only 2 power grid companies in China, which manage the northern provinces, State Grid, and the southern provinces, Southern Grid. Therefore, China's power grid is basically under unified management, unified construction, and unified collaboration. Although India's power grid is small in scale, its structure is relatively complex. It is divided into Central Power Company, State Grid Company, State Power Companies, Private Power Companies, and some rural power companies. The power grid is divided into different areas, making mutual coordination and unified management difficult. 3. Grid scale. If we calculate the high-voltage transmission network above 200 kV, China has built approximately 800,000 kilometers and India has approximately 460,000 kilometers. If we calculate the supertransmission network above 800 kV, China has built approximately 46,000 kilometers, while India has only 5,300 kilometers. Supertransmission networks are mainly used to transmit electricity over long distances. For example, China transports hydropower, solar and wind power from uninhabited areas in the west to densely populated areas in the east. It needs to span thousands of kilometers and must rely on such a network. Otherwise, the electricity generated in these areas will not be consumed and will be wasted in large quantities. Currently 80% of the world's supertransmission network is located in China. Such a superpower network would connect China's energy-rich provinces in the west with the densely populated provinces in the east, transporting power from the west to the east. The east pays for this, and the funds are used for development and subsidies in the west. This energy transmission efficiency is much more efficient than transporting coal, oil, and natural gas by rail. The same problem exists in India, where the west and north have more energy, while the east and south have more developed economies. But India lacks a supertransmission network like China, which makes India's electricity transportation losses very high. According to the National Grid of India, the loss rate of electricity transmission in India is 21.03%. United States 5.92%. China 6.78%. Russia 10.17%. The wastage rate in almost all states in India is above 15%, and in some states the wastage rate even exceeds 50%. The lag in power grid technology and management has caused a large amount of waste of electricity in India. 4. Coverage. China's power grid has covered all administrative regions across the country, including some remote villages. According to data from relevant organizations, China's electricity supply covers almost 100% of the population. India's power grid mainly covers cities, while coverage in rural areas is poor. According to relevant United Nations data, although the Indian government has been working hard to improve it, there are still about 260 million people in India outside the coverage of the power grid. 5. Reliability. China's power grid is relatively strong and reliable. Grid failures rarely lead to large-scale power outages. In 2022, drought in western China led to insufficient power generation from many hydropower stations, causing power shortages in Chengdu for several days, forcing some factories and office buildings to close. This is the most serious situation in China in the past 20 years, but it is not caused by a power grid failure. Power grid failures and large-scale power outages occur more frequently in India. In the past few years, large-scale power grid failures and long-term power outages have occurred in areas such as Uttar Pradesh and Kolkata. The blackout in 2012 even affected 600 million people, making it the largest blackout in human history. 6. Clean energy. China versus India. Wind 656, 68. Hydro, 1300:160. Solar 327, 68. In fact, it is unfair to compare the scale of clean energy in China and India. China's scale of clean energy is the sum of the next 9 countries. 7. Technical level. China has the most powerful power system and technical capabilities in the world, and the State Grid Corporation of China has the most technology patents among power companies in the world. The patented technologies they master even exceed those of famous technology companies such as Huawei, IBM, and Apple. World-leading solutions such as UHV transmission technology, supercritical coal-fired power generation technology, flexible green grid technology, fourth-generation nuclear power plant technology, molten salt power generation technology, etc. are all mastered by Chinese companies. They not only build a large number of power facilities domestically, but also undertake many giant power projects around the world. They are building nuclear power plants in the UK and ultra-high voltage transmission networks in Brazil. They are selling photovoltaic panels on a large scale in the US and wind turbines in Europe. India's power grid construction technology level is relatively low, and it relies heavily on multinational companies to provide solutions, which lags far behind China. 8. Price. As requested by some readers, I updated residential electricity prices in 2 countries. In fact, household electricity prices in China and India are relatively low, lower than those in most developed countries. The electricity prices in the 2 countries are very close, which helps ordinary people obtain cheap electricity. Of course, since India's per capita income is much lower than that of China, Indian households have a higher burden to use the same amount of electricity. This is why, although China is not as hot as India, Chinese households buy 8 times as many air conditioners as India every year. However, India's commercial electricity prices are too high, 50% higher than China's, which is a fatal blow to India's manufacturing industry. Think about it, the cost of electricity to manufacture a car in India is 50% higher than in China. What does this mean? Overall, it's hardly fair to compare India's power grids with those of China. China is the world's largest industrial country. Their annual electricity production and transmission is twice that of the United States and 5 times that of India. Behind such a huge scale is a unique level of technology and forward-looking applications. They are the first in the world in almost every field. India is only a small player compared to China. In fact, in this field, any country in the world is a small player compared to China.